I'm 79 years old, and my best friend has been gone for 9 months. Some mornings I still reach for the phone before I remember there's nobody on the other side anymore. That realization lands the same way every time. Quiet, final. His name was Daniel. Most people called him Danny, but I always called him Dan. I don't know why. It just fit. Like we'd agreed, without saying it, that we were going to take each other seriously. We met when we were 24. We lived in the same neighborhood and kept running into each other at the corner tea place. He had this easy way about him, like he belonged wherever he stood. I was the opposite. I was always trying to look like I had something important to do. One morning, my bicycle chain snapped on the way to work. I was crouched in the dust, grease on my fingers, angry at the whole world. Dan walked by with a bag of bread under his arm. He didn't laugh. He just squatted down and said, "Move over." He fixed it with his hands. No tools. Wiped his fingers on his pants like it was nothing. Then he walked with me all the way to my office so I wouldn't be late. That was Dan. He didn't make a big speech. He just showed up. After that, he kept showing up. Saturday mornings at the market. Evenings on the stoop when it was too hot inside. We'd argue about politics we barely understood. We'd talk about work, about money, about whatever we thought men were supposed to talk about. I worked at the municipal office. Paperwork, stamps, files, a steady job. Dan worked at an electrical supply shop. He knew the names of every part, every wire, every tiny piece people don't notice until something stops working. He talked about those things like they mattered, like everything had a purpose. We got married around the same time. My wife, Farah, used to pretend she was annoyed when Dan visited because he never came empty-handed. Fruit, sweets, some little thing he thought I needed. He had a generous spirit that didn't feel heavy. It was just how he moved through life. Dan married Linda, quiet woman, kind eyes, the sort of person who remembers details without effort. They had one son. Farah and I had 2 daughters. Our lives ran side by side for decades. Not perfectly, but close enough that I never imagined one could disappear without the other. In our 30s, life started to crowd in. Kids, bills, parents getting older, work getting heavier. Dan and I still met, but it wasn't as simple anymore. It started to take planning, and slowly, without any dramatic fight, I became the one who postponed things. Dan would call and say, "Let's go for tea." And I'd say, "Not this week." I'd say, "I'm tired." I'd say, "Next weekend." I wasn't lying. I really was busy. I really was tired. I really did have responsibilities. But if I'm honest, I was also addicted to being needed, to being responsible, to being the man who always had something on his plate. It made me feel valuable. And I treated Dan like he was safe, like he'd always be there in the background, steady and patient, like a lamp you don't think about until the light goes out. I remember one evening, winter, fog in the air. Dan stood at my front door with his jacket on, hair damp. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said no. I said I had to finish something. He looked past me into the house, like he could tell nothing urgent was happening. Then he nodded and said, "Okay, I'll see you." No anger, no guilt, just that calm patience. And I shut the door. It wasn't one big mistake. It was 100 small shut doors. When I got promoted in my 40s, Dan came to my office with a small box of sweets. He looked genuinely proud of me, like my success made his day brighter. I remember feeling awkward, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because his pride was clean. No jealousy, no competition, just love, plain and simple. I said, "It's nothing," like a fool. He frowned slightly and said, "It's not nothing." Then he smiled and changed the subject because he could always sense when I was getting stiff. That was the thing about him. He knew how to sit near your truth without forcing it out of you. My father died when I was 47. The house was full of people and noise and food and prayers. Dan stayed longer than anyone. When the crowd thinned out, he sat with me in the quiet. He made tea, he washed cups, he did small chores like he belonged there. At one point, I started to cry, quietly, the way men try to cry when they don't want anyone to see. Dan put his hand on my shoulder, and I remember thinking, I should tell him something. I should tell him how much he meant, how much that moment mattered. how I didn't know what I'd do without him. But I didn't say it. I cleared my throat and asked if he wanted more tea. That's what I did with feelings. I turned them into tasks. Years went by. Dan's son moved away. Dan tried to joke about it, but I could see the loss in him. The house got quieter for him. He started visiting more, sitting with Farah and me, watching old films, eating whatever Farah put in front of him. Sometimes I caught him staring at our family photos on the wall, not with envy, with something softer, like he was holding a memory and a wish at the same time. He'd talk about his son carefully, like the subject itself could bruise if handled wrong. I listened, but not as deeply as I should have. I kept offering cheerful words. I kept dodging the heavier truth. In our 60s, health problems started. Dan developed diabetes. He managed it, but it changed his energy. He walked slower, carried snacks in his pocket, complained less than most people would. We still met, but less. Weeks slipped, then months, and it felt normal. That's the scary part. It doesn't feel like damage while it's happening. It just feels like life. Then Linda called me one Tuesday afternoon. Her voice sounded thin. She said, "Dan is in the hospital." I said, "What happened?" Like it was a small thing. She said, "They found something in his lungs. When I went to see him, he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Hollow cheeks, skin with that gray tint, like the color had drained out. But his eyes were still his eyes. He saw me and smiled. He said, 'You came.'" I tried to joke. I said, "Of course I came." We talked about small things. Nurses, food, my grandson's school. He asked about Farah. He asked about my daughters. He asked questions like he was gathering pieces of a life he loved because he could feel it narrowing. Then he looked out the window and said very quietly, "I don't think I'm coming home." I panicked, not outwardly, inside. I said, "Don't talk like that. You'll be fine." He turned his head and looked at me, not angry, just tired, and said, "You always say that." That sentence went through me because he was right. I always said that. I always pushed away the truth. I always tried to keep things light, like lightness could protect us. He sighed and said, "You don't like heavy things." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say I'd been there through everything, but I knew what he meant. There was a sentence sitting in my throat, the one I'd been avoiding for decades. I wanted to say, "I love you, Dan," not in a dramatic way, just the plain truth. I wanted to say, "You mattered to me more than you ever knew." I wanted to say, "I'm sorry I treated our friendship like it was guaranteed." I didn't say any of it. Instead, I asked him if he wanted water. He nodded, and I helped him drink, and I hated myself for how natural it felt to choose usefulness over honesty. I visited him over the next few weeks. Some days he joked, some days he slept. Sometimes I sat with Linda in the hallway while she told me things about him I never knew. Private fears, private hopes, the things husbands share with wives when the world is closing in. One night, Dan was awake and clear. The room was dim. The television was on without sound. He said, "Do you remember that summer we took the bus to the lake and got stuck there because we spent our money on food?" I laughed. I remembered. Two young idiots, sunburned, acting like it was an adventure. He smiled, then his smile faded. He said, "I miss being young." I said, "Me too." He nodded, then said, "I miss when you used to talk." I felt embarrassed, like a child caught doing something wrong. He said softly, "Not about work, about you." What was going on inside? He waited, and I failed again. I said, "I'm here now." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded like he accepted what I could give, like he wasn't going to force me to become a different man in the last chapter. 2 days later, he was moved into hospice care. I visited on a Sunday morning. Dan was asleep. Linda was holding his hand, eyes red but steady, like she'd already walked through a fire. I sat on the other side of the bed and watched him breathe. The pauses between breaths were longer than they should have been. I leaned in and whispered, "Dan, it's me." His eyelids fluttered. His fingers twitched like some part of him knew. That should have been my moment. The clean moment people imagine. The final chance to say everything. but the room was so quiet and real, and I was still the same man who had practiced silence for a lifetime. I said, "You rest. I'll be here." He died that night. I wasn't there. I'd gone home because Farah was tired and my back hurt, and I told myself I'd come back in the morning. Linda called at 2:40 a.m. and said, "He's gone." After the funeral, after the food nobody tasted, after the prayers and the shaking hands, I came home and the quiet hit me again. I started hearing him everywhere, his laugh, his knock, the way he used to say my name. I listened to old voicemails, nothing poetic, nothing dramatic, just "call me when you can," just "I'm outside," just "tell Farah I'm bringing fruit." And one afternoon it hit me in the simplest, ugliest way. I had never told him what he was to me. I told myself men of our generation didn't say those things. I told myself it would have been awkward. I told myself it was understood. But when I look back, I see his face in that hospital room. I see him waiting. I see him trying to open the door for me gently. He was ready to hear it. Maybe he needed to hear it. And I kept choosing comfort over truth. If you're listening and you still have someone, one person, who has stayed close to you through years, I'm not going to preach at you. I don't know your life. I don't know what words you can say without feeling strange in your own mouth. I only know what it feels like to run out of chances. I know what it feels like to realize you gave errands instead of honesty, jokes instead of gratitude, next week instead of presents. The world doesn't pause and hand you a perfect moment. Most of the time, the moment is small. It's a phone call you almost don't return. It's a walk you almost decline. It's a quiet pause in a conversation where you could say something real and you choose not to. I chose not to, again and again, until the person who should have heard it was no longer here. If this meant something to you, and you feel like it, you can share a thought in the comments. Maybe the name of someone you miss. Maybe a sentence you wish you'd said. You don't have to make it pretty, just real. As for me, I sit in my living room and I look at the chair where Dan used to sit. It's just a chair, but it feels like a witness. Sometimes I speak out loud into the room. I say, "You mattered to me." I say, "I'm sorry." I say, "Thank you." The air doesn't answer. It doesn't undo anything. It just reminds me that some words belong to the living. Now, at 79, I try to live whatever time I have left with fewer shut doors. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just a little more honest, while there's still someone here to hear it.